Well, it'll be interesting to understand a little bit more what Modi's return to power means for the infrastructure stocks, whether or not we're going to see that capex push continue, big investments, are they going to be lined up for clean energy, and what importantly is going to be on the 100-day agenda. Vinayak Chatterjee, founder and managing trustee at the InfraVision Foundation, now joins in to discuss that and more. Thanks so much for taking time out. And clearly, policy continuity, I think, is something that the markets have been largely depending on, in particular when it comes to the infrastructure space. What is it that you're expecting here?
Thank you, and good morning. Yes, we are at the beginning of another, hopefully massive cycle on infrastructure investments. So you are right in your opening observation that the broad policy thrust will continue. But I would like to use this occasion to share with your viewers my thoughts on 7 areas where I think the focus is now going to shift. There's going to be a little bit of reprioritization based on the election results. I think, and it is to address 2 issues, both job creation as well as better focus on rural livelihoods. So let me give you my take on the top 8 structural shifts is probably not the right word. Reprioritization and a better focus are probably better descriptors, but here goes. I am reasonably certain that in these coming 5 years, there's going to be a significant shift of focus, policy interventions and outlays from road to rail, because road has already reached a level of maturity and rail is crying out for attention. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is that on power sector, the capacity build up going back to coal thermal as well as the push on green energy is well underway. The focus has to be on 3 areas. Storage, which is basically storage for green energy, consisting of pump storage projects, as battery storage, and in the medium term, hydrogen. The second issue would be the issue of moving ahead now. It's been a long time on discom privatization and or what is now called provision of automatic second licenses or parallel licenses. That's for the power sector. On 3, I think there has already been reasonably vigorous, shall we say, entreaties to the finance ministry even before the last 3 budgets, that the 28% GST on cement seems to be inappropriate, considering that it's an Aam Aadmi product, it's an infrastructure input, and taxing it at the sin road of 28% GST does not seem to be logical. So I am actually expecting in these 5 years, the 28% GST on cement to be reduced substantially. Let us see whether it comes down to 18 or 12. Moving on to point number 5, a significant amount of capex has happened in the water sector, and there are many ongoing plans and programs. The real issue before the government now is to convert the massive capex that has happened in the Jal Jeevan mission, or what is popularly called Nal Se Jal, where 24/7 potable drinking water is to be made available to every household in the country. That needs now a shift of attention from capex to actually operations, to see that that kind of water with that level of service is actually delivered. So it's a huge mammoth OPEX task, operational involvement task. Moving on to urban infra, I think there are clearly 3 deliverables that are crying out for attention. One is, as the FM has said in our last 2 budget speeches, we now have to gear up our urban local bodies to be able to have the capacity to raise municipal bonds, which should fund their own infra projects. Point 2, there is huge degree of concern on the viability of metro rail because of last mile linkage issues and various other public transport linkage issues. So the creation of the 2006 policy, which is still awaiting real-time implementation, UMTA, Unified Metropolitan Transport Authority, needs to be done in these next 5 years. My second last point is on digital infra. As all of us have seen and are excited about the Tata entry and the few others into manufacturing of chip and fabrication of semiconductors, there is a 76,000 crore incentive budget and a support budget by the government. I understand there are 3 or 4 more serious players with very capable foreign joint venture partners waiting in the wings. That 76,000 crore budget now needs to be doubled, and therefore a big push for digital infra, particularly data centers is well on its way, but particularly for promoting another 3 or 4 world-class projects on chip and fabrication. And my last point is on what I started with, is to address rural distress. And I think while enough programs from Manrega to minor irrigation, rural roads are well underway, I would actually urge the government, which itself has a regulator called the Warehouse Development Regulatory Authority, to actually pick up the baton and create a modern chain of rural warehouses for procuring, storage, and dispatch with all modern ambient conditions of moisture, air conditioning, pesticide, all the things that are required in modern societies for preservation of foodstuff, and also to promote something that has not really taken off in the country, which will help our farmers, is warehouse receipts-based commodity trading. These measures would go towards supplementing all the other rural projects. So I am actually focusing also on modern rural warehousing to supplement other rural projects. But that's my list of 8. Over to you.
Right, and quite a in-depth one at that. But Vinayak, let me, pick it up point by point. And let's first tie in with your second last point, which was on data centers, to the first one, which was on power. Because, part of the power demand surge is also coming in from data centers, I guess. Wanted to understand, you were making the point that you actually see that the focus is going to be on the power sector, it's going to be on storage, it's going to be on discom privatization. Do you think the country right now has the wherewithal to try and cater to this demand? Or do you think it will require a lot of capex? What, according to you, could be the hurdles and the challenges?
You've asked me 2 questions. One on the push on data centers. That is inevitable. I think India will obviously have to create its own network of data centers, and that push is well underway. The leading companies of the world are using our Indian business houses have created strings of data centers, and many more are coming. And by and large, they're all supported by green energy, which is a very good consumption story for green energy also, and brings in the world to our country. So the data center question is well established. Coming to your issue of discoms, look, it has now been about 3 to 4 decades that we've all been cribbing about discoms. It is also true that in a large measure, with a variety of rules, regulations, and disciplining, discoms are today functioning far better. But that does not mean that they are at levels of service and efficiency that are acceptable to consumers. And therefore, the issue of bringing in private sector has always raised its head. And there have been 1 or 2 notable successes like Tata Power in Orissa and the privatization of Delhi. But they're older stories now. The new stories, every time they have been unleashed, have received a political backlash, largely from the unions. The privatization initiative of Chandigarh Union Territory got a massive pushback with a 48-hour strike by the engineers. Uttar Pradesh embarked on the journey but had to pull it back. The question is, we now have to gather the political will to allow private sector to enter the private distribution area. And there are 2 choices. If privatization is going to be difficult, then provide market access. After all, many infra sectors like civil aviation, telecom were all enhanced not necessarily by privatization, but by allowing private sector to enter that field, which is called market access. And in the distribution area, market access is going to be provided by what is called allowing a second person to distribute electricity, either at what is called second licensee or parallel licensee. And I think that certainly needs to be pushed if outright privatization gets politically difficult. Back to you.
Well, that there is going to be quite a bit of focus when it comes to the global stage. So do you think that there is going to be a lot on that front, perhaps? And what is the outlook as well when it comes to the defense sector?
Look, I am no expert on defense. All I know, as much as I read the daily newspapers and see discussion on television, but it is very clear that the government, even in the last term, has heavily pushed Indian production of defense and armaments, both in the public sector as very largely in the private sector also, so that defense is gradually unfolding. And in these next 5 years, I can bet that it will be a success story. India's share of imports will reduce, and India's share of exporting defense to the rest of the world will improve. It will involve large private players, and that's going to be very, very good for India. Your second question was about globalization. I am going to be speaking only about infrastructure sector. And as you know, the trends are very clear that Indian infrastructure developers are now looking outwards, whether it is ports, whether it is airports, whether it is renewable energy, whether it is coal thermal in select countries. There is a very big push to now look beyond the shores of India and actually, in a sense, capitalize on our preeminent geopolitical stature that India has now received to start building infrastructure projects in and around our country, which is the Indian Ocean Rim, Bay of Bengal, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Gulf, and for which there is an active push and there are already projects happening. I think what is required in this case is that the government must focus on a complete revamp of Export-Import Bank of India, Exim Bank. You know, a large part of the success of the Chinese story was the kind of support they got from the Chinese Export-Import Bank. You know, immediate liquidity, soft loans, long tenure loans, guarantees, etc. Our Exim Bank seems to have been caught in a time warp where they basically lend only for commercial project financing. It has to rise above that and take a geopolitical country view and completely revamp its products and services to aid Indian developers to go aggressively overseas. Over to you.
Chatterjee, I must tell you, you've really shaken up the entire cement sector. You know, the minute you said that you do expect that 28% GST to come down because it's unreasonably high, all the stocks are actually holding up very well.
Well, it's an expectation. I mean, people must understand that it's just an expectation which has been making the rounds for almost 2-3 years.
The cement basket seems very exciting. But Mr. Chatterjee, we've spoken about the railway sector time and again with you. So which is why I want you to focus on water infrastructure, because in some sense, this is a very untapped area. We know a lot of ministers have already talked about as to how they want to commercialize waterways. But where within this entire segment do you think lies the opportunity?
Well, I wouldn't get too excited about commercializing waterways, because that's a long haul task and there are more immediate things to address. Most importantly, I think India must embark on a new generation of major and minor irrigation projects. I don't see too much of them happening. And you always see in the heat of summer, a farmer sitting on a parched field and you wonder what happened to irrigation. So it's important for the government to focus on creating a new generation of major and minor irrigation projects. That's priority number one. Priority number two is what I told you earlier in the project. We must now ensure that the big capital outlays for the Jal Jeevan mission actually translate into 24/7 potable water, which the village panchayat water committees take ownership for in terms of running it on a day-to-day basis, to see that that capex gets converted to opex and that there is a sustainable framework at the grassroots level to see that potable drinking water in every home in India is not a dream anymore. The third thing is that for the first time in independent India, 4 or 5 months back, was published the first ever, remember, the first ever census of water bodies in this country. I'm surprised that it was done so late in our history, but anyway, it's done. And the preliminary findings, which surprisingly have not been too well discussed in the media, point to a huge degree of concern on the way we handle our water bodies, both rural and urban. There is encroachment, there is drying up, there is lack of accountability, there is lack of ownership, there is lack even of community ownership. So a massive program for rejuvenation and resuscitation of water bodies in urban and rural India. And finally, the issue of circularity, that how do cities largely manage their water and effluent discharge, a new generation of effluent treatment plants, not just for river cleaning, but generally for recycling the water back after scientific treatment. But let me stop here.
Okay, appreciate your time. It's been very insightful getting your views on what the expectations are from the entire infrastructure sector as a whole. Thank you for joining in.